November 1916. The Somme, northern France. A cold gray dawn seeps through the ragged clouds, casting a muted pallor over the endless churned mud of the front lines. Rain falls in a relentless drizzle, turning trenches into rivers of sludge. Soldiers huddle in the narrow, splintered walls of the earthworks, their uniforms soaked, boots waterlogged, faces streaked with grime and exhaustion. The air is thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid bite of gunpowder from yesterday's artillery barrage. Somewhere beyond the fog, the low rumble of distant shells shakes the earth, a constant reminder of death's proximity. Here, the enemy is not only the man across no man's land, but the trench itself, a suffocating, disease-ridden maze. Men sink silently into the mud, their bodies succumbing not to bullets, but to waterlogged boots, infections, and the creeping numbness of trench foot. The floodwaters rise steadily, swallowing foxholes, drowning the weak, the slow, the unlucky. Artillery pounds relentlessly, collapsing walls of earth onto those trapped within. Death arrives in slow, silent waves, unseen by history, unrecorded in honor rolls, yet leaving behind its unmistakable shadow. Beneath the roar of guns, the trenches themselves claim their victims, and a nightmare begins. By the summer of 1914, Europe teetered on the edge of war. National ambitions, tangled alliances, and decades of militarization had created a continent primed for conflict. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo, the dominoes fell with ruthless speed. Germany, bound by treaties and strategic imperatives, mobilized against France and Russia. Britain, bound to Belgium's defense, declared war on Germany. Within weeks, millions of men were swept into uniform, bound for front lines neither fully understood nor geographically familiar. The Western Front, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, quickly ossified into a battlefield of mud, steel, and despair. By late 1914, both sides had dug in, literally. Trenches carved into the scarred landscape became defensive fortresses, interlinked with barbed wire, machine gun nests, and communication tunnels. They were intended as protection from the new lethality of modern warfare. The repeating rifle, the machine gun, and high-explosive artillery had rendered open-field maneuvers suicidal. Yet these trenches would themselves become instruments of suffering. Logistics shaped life in the trenches almost as much as enemy fire. Supplies of food, water, and medical equipment were erratic. Rain and artillery destroyed roads and rail lines, making resupply perilous. Soldiers relied on rations of black bread, tinned meat, and weak tea, often insufficient for energy or morale. Water collected in shell craters, puddles, and poorly dug trenches, contaminated with mud and human waste. Latrines overflowed. Disease thrived. Trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp, cold, and unsanitary conditions, became rampant, sometimes resulting in gangrene and amputation. Commanders faced the impossible task of maintaining discipline and offensive pressure in this environment. Generals such as Douglas Haig for the British and Fritz von Below for the Germans directed operations from distant observation posts. Their understanding filtered through reports that often lagged days behind reality. The calculus of attrition drove strategy. The goal was not maneuver, but the gradual exhaustion of the enemy. Artillery barrages became both a prelude and an omnipresent threat, capable of pulverizing trenches in minutes. Soldiers, trapped in narrow earthworks, could be buried alive under collapsing walls, unable to escape even if the enemy attack faltered. Civilian populations near the front endured displacement and loss, though the trenches themselves became almost entirely the domain of soldiers. They were isolated from normal life, subjected to constant noise, mud, vermin, and the omnipresent threat of sudden death. Letters from home were infrequent, censored, and often delivered weeks late. Troop rotations were irregular. Soldiers might spend weeks in the front-line trenches before relief, their bodies and minds gradually eroded. Frost, heat, rain, and mud were relentless. Winter turned trenches into icy canals, while summer brought swarms of flies, lice, and rats that devoured rations and sometimes flesh. The human cost extended beyond combat wounds. Pneumonia, dysentery, typhus, and influenza swept through battalions weakened by exposure and exhaustion. Reports from field hospitals described soldiers succumbing not to bullets, but to infections that would now be considered preventable. The fear of trench foot or being trapped under a collapsed parapet became a constant companion, a slow, invisible terror. Commanders knew the dangers, yet solutions were limited. Drainage was imperfect, trench construction rushed, and protective measures inadequate. War itself was a crucible in which technology and human endurance clashed relentlessly. By 1915, the scale of entrenchment had transformed warfare. Both sides adopted networks of front-line, support, and reserve trenches, connected by communication trenches, often stretching hundreds of kilometers. The space between opposing lines, known as no man's land, was a wasteland of mud, barbed wire, and shell craters. Patrols and reconnaissance were deadly. A misstep could lead to death by rifle, machine gun, or artillery. Yet even soldiers who survived combat risked succumbing to the trenches themselves. Stagnant water, mud that swallowed boots and legs, collapsing parapets under bombardment. These were daily hazards as lethal as any enemy bullet. The context of these conditions provides the necessary backdrop to understand the silent horrors of trench life. Soldiers were not only fighting an enemy, but a landscape engineered for suffering. Command decisions prioritized territorial gain over individual safety. Weather and geography conspired to create environments where survival required constant vigilance and endurance. The human body, exposed to wet, cold, disease, and exhaustion, often failed before bullets could reach it. This was a war in which death was measured not only by battle, but by the slow, relentless toll of exposure, disease, and entrapment. As the seasons turned and battles such as Verdun and the Somme unfolded, the trenches remained both protector and predator. Soldiers learned that the earth itself could kill, that survival demanded more than courage. It demanded endurance in the face of mud, water, vermin, and disease. And within these narrow, fetid corridors of warfare, countless men would meet deaths unrecorded in heroic accounts, drowning in flooded foxholes, succumbing to trench foot, or buried alive beneath artillery's fury. These conditions set the stage for the most harrowing aspect of the Western Front: the slow, invisible, and agonizing deaths that awaited soldiers not from rifles, but from the trenches themselves. By 1916, the Western Front had calcified into a grueling stalemate. Commanders on both sides understood that victory would require attrition, yet the strategies deployed often failed to mitigate the human cost. At the Somme, the British Expeditionary Force, numbering over 1 million men, faced an entrenched German defense network. Artillery was concentrated in unprecedented volumes. Over 1.5 million shells were fired in the opening week alone. Yet while bombardment flattened terrain and destroyed barbed wire, the trenches themselves often remained intact, collapsing unpredictably under the weight of explosions or persistent rain. Soldiers who survived initial barrages frequently found themselves trapped in mud-filled foxholes or buried beneath parapets, a terrifying mixture of human error, weather, and technology. The geography of the front exacerbated these conditions. Low-lying fields, cratered from years of shelling, became marshes in autumn rains. Communication trenches, essential for moving men and supplies, were prone to flooding, sometimes leaving soldiers stranded for days in ankle or knee-deep water. Field reports from the Royal Army Medical Corps detail men suffering hypothermia, gangrene, and infection, their cries muffled by the roar of distant artillery. These were deaths that arrived slowly, unnoticed by enemy fire, yet just as lethal and often more agonizing. Leadership faced a paradox. The need to sustain offensive pressure collided with the physical limitations of men and terrain. Commanders like General Sir Douglas Haig and German General Fritz von Below issued orders based on incomplete intelligence. Maps showing lines where trenches had long since collapsed or shifted. Patrols were sent into flooded sections of no man's land, only to be swept away by hidden mud pits. The psychological toll was severe. Soldiers reported a pervasive dread of the trenches themselves, fear not only of the enemy, but of drowning, infection, or being buried alive under a collapsing wall of earth. Military discipline was strained as units struggled to maintain cohesion while wading through muck, rat-infested tunnels, and freezing water. Technology shaped the danger as much as terrain. High explosive shells caused devastating collapses, and repeated bombardments churned the ground into treacherous mud. Water-resistant boots were in short supply, and even when issued, they did little to prevent trench foot. Improvised duckboards provided only partial relief, often submerged under floodwaters. Field hospitals reported entire platoons rendered immobile by swollen, gangrenous feet, some requiring amputation. Medical supplies were insufficient, and evacuation under fire was perilous. Soldiers waited days for treatment, many succumbing before they could receive it. Communication difficulties compounded the chaos. Runners traversing flooded trenches risked being swept away. Messengers were delayed by shelling, and signal lines were frequently severed. Units often went without orders or updates, trapped in sections of trenches that had become isolated islands of mud and despair. Commanders could not intervene rapidly, leaving men to confront the lethal conditions largely alone. In accounts preserved by the Imperial War Museum, soldiers describe waking to find their comrades missing, pulled into hidden water-filled shell craters or crushed beneath parapet collapses. These were deaths absent from maps and casualty lists, yet etched deeply into the memory of survivors. Troop rotations, intended to relieve men from the front, were unpredictable and unevenly implemented. Some battalions remained weeks on the line, exposed to the elements and deteriorating trench structures, while others rotated more frequently. Relief often arrived in the form of support trenches, themselves dangerous mazes, where soldiers had to navigate debris, mud, and the ever-present risk of sudden collapse. Prolonged exposure led to exhaustion, heightened susceptibility to disease, and impaired judgment. All factors that increased the likelihood of fatal accidents. Civilian involvement added another layer of complexity. French farmers, villagers, and townspeople had fled or were displaced, leaving fields untended and drainage systems destroyed. Flooded terrain could not be mitigated, leaving soldiers to face water levels rising with each rainstorm. Horses and mules used for supply often became stuck or drowned, cutting off food, water, and ammunition. Soldiers improvised makeshift solutions, sandbags, timber, and planks, to reinforce walls and raise walkways above water. Yet the scale of the devastation and relentless rain often rendered these efforts insufficient, leaving men trapped in conditions that were lethal even without enemy engagement. Intelligence and reconnaissance, crucial for planning operations, were similarly limited. Aerial photographs could identify trench lines, but they revealed little about water depth, mud consistency, or the stability of parapets. Patrol reports were often contradictory, and commanders could not accurately assess the risk of collapse or flooding. Decisions made on incomplete information sometimes sent men into sections of trenches that were already untenable. Soldiers faced the dual threat of enemy fire and environmental hazards, forced to navigate a battlefield that was both visible and hidden, predictable and treacherous. The cumulative effect of these conditions transformed the Western Front into a slow, silent executioner. Artillery, rain, mud, disease, and unstable trenches claimed lives with a methodical inevitability. Soldiers learned that survival depended not only on courage, but on vigilance, physical resilience, and often, luck. It was a war in which the earth itself, reshaped by human conflict, became the deadliest weapon. These operational realities, terrain, weather, supply, leadership, and technology, set the stage for the unimaginable human suffering in the trenches. As winter approached, the ground would harden in some places, flood in others, and continue to claim lives in the slowest, most agonizing ways imaginable. In this environment, the stage was set for the most painful and silent deaths of World War I, where soldiers would be devoured by mud, water, and earth, long before bullets ever reached them. The trenches of the Western Front were a theater of human endurance as much as a battlefield. Soldiers lived under a canopy of mud, rain, and shrapnel, their senses attuned to the slightest shift in the landscape. Every footstep could sink into hidden, water-filled craters. Every movement could dislodge a saturated parapet. First-hand accounts from survivors describe waking to find their boots submerged, the cold water creeping through woolen socks and sodden uniforms, their feet swollen and numb. Trench foot, an affliction caused by prolonged exposure to moisture, cold, and unsanitary conditions, became a silent killer. Corpses were sometimes discovered with feet blackened, gangrenous, the result of infections that medical officers struggled to treat amid constant bombardment. It was a death that arrived gradually, its agony invisible to those outside the trenches, leaving soldiers immobilized and vulnerable even to minor shelling or sniper fire. The human experience extended beyond physical suffering. Psychological strain was relentless. Men reported a chronic dread, not only of the enemy, but of the trench itself. Floodwaters could rise overnight, drowning foxholes, swallowing sandbags, and trapping men under boards meant to keep them above the water. Rats scuttled over bodies and rations alike, spreading disease and adding a layer of constant filth. Sleep was fitful. Shell fire rumbled through the earth, echoing through trenches like the groan of some living entity. Soldiers became hyper-aware of every collapse, every distant crack of artillery, every shift of water or mud that might herald death. Commanders attempted to maintain discipline, but fear and exhaustion were pervasive, and units were often forced to operate in near impossible conditions. The tactical dimension magnified the peril. Front-line trenches were rarely isolated. They formed networks connected to support and reserve lines, often across low, waterlogged terrain. When orders called for assaults, troops had to traverse communication trenches that doubled as canals, wading through freezing water and mud. Movement was slow, exposing men to enemy observation and artillery fire. Flooded trenches hampered evacuation, leaving injured soldiers to wait hours or even days for medical attention. Artillery, designed to weaken enemy positions before an advance, often caused the very walls of the trenches to collapse, burying men alive beneath tons of saturated earth. Engineering defenses, intended to save lives, inadvertently created new hazards when neglected, overused, or struck by explosive force. Technological factors played a dual role in this lethal environment. Weapons and explosives reshaped terrain in permanent, unpredictable ways. Repeated bombardments pulverized earthworks, leaving craters that trapped men and horses alike. Gas attacks, though primarily aimed at causing casualties, also introduced contamination into the already fetid water of trenches, exacerbating infections. Even basic equipment was inadequate for the environmental hazards. Standard-issue leather boots became waterlogged. Trench coats offered limited insulation. Sandbags, wooden planks, and duckboards often failed under persistent rainfall. Engineers tried to reinforce walls with timber, but shortages of materials and constant shelling meant that structural failures were frequent, with catastrophic consequences for men caught beneath them. Command decisions contributed directly to these silent fatalities. Military leadership operated on incomplete or outdated intelligence. Officers often ordered patrols or relief movements without awareness of water depths, mud consistency, or compromised parapets. Units were sent into sections already destabilized by prior shelling, heavy rainfall, or collapsed trenches. Messages were delayed or lost in the chaos of flooded tunnels, leaving men isolated and without guidance. The calculus of attrition prioritized objectives over individual safety, a strategic approach that transformed environmental hazards into mechanisms of death. Decisions made in observation posts far from the front lines reverberated in slow, agonizing ways for soldiers trapped below. Enemy strategy and countermeasures compounded the dangers. German engineers reinforced trench systems with layers of sandbags, timber, and concrete, creating a defensive network that was difficult to navigate even under ideal conditions. Allied forces attempting reconnaissance or repair work often became targets for snipers, machine gun fire, or artillery designed to collapse trenches. Conversely, German soldiers faced identical hazards in reverse. Saturated front lines, frozen or flooded support trenches, and artillery that made even their own positions treacherous. Both sides endured the duality of the trench. Protection from direct fire, yet a potential instrument of death. Survival was a balance between tactical necessity and the ever-present threat of environmental collapse. Medical and logistical considerations further illustrate the lethal complexity of trench life. Field hospitals were frequently located behind the front, but reaching them often required wading through mud, water, and barbed wire while under threat of shell fire. Evacuation of injured soldiers was perilous and treatment delayed. Infections spread rapidly, compounded by unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, gangrene, pneumonia, and influenza claimed lives quietly, without the immediate spectacle of bullets or shells. Reports from the Royal Army Medical Corps emphasized that some units lost more men to environmental and disease-related causes than to direct combat in a given month. The trenches were as much a medical hazard as a battlefield. Morale and psychology were deeply affected by these conditions. Soldiers adapted to survive, but were aware of the invisible threats surrounding them. Fear of being buried alive, of drowning in floodwaters, or succumbing to gangrene was omnipresent. Letters from the front describe a pervading sense of helplessness and the realization that courage alone could not guarantee survival. Yet within this environment, small acts of ingenuity, solidarity, and vigilance allowed men to endure. Duckboards were placed above floodwaters. Sandbags were stacked to reinforce collapsing walls. Comrades assisted each other to dry clothing or clean wounds. Survival required both collective effort and constant attention to an environment that was actively hostile. The combined lens of human experience, tactical complexity, technology, leadership, and enemy countermeasures reveals a war in which death often came not in moments of valor, but in slow, unseen processes. Soldiers could survive artillery barrages only to be claimed by mud, water, or disease. Courage was necessary, but insufficient. Endurance and adaptability determined who would emerge alive from the trenches. Each dimension, physical, tactical, technological, psychological, intersected to create a lethal environment where the Earth itself became an agent of war. This perspective sets the stage for the second section of Angles, where we will continue to explore technological innovation, logistical struggles, and the command dilemmas that shaped the most agonizing deaths of the Western Front. The technological dimension of trench warfare magnified the lethality of the environment. Artillery, the dominant weapon of the Western Front, reshaped terrain as effectively as it destroyed human bodies. High explosive shells obliterated earthworks, creating craters that filled with rainwater and mud. These craters often became death traps, invisible to reconnaissance patrols and treacherous even for experienced soldiers. Engineers attempted to reinforce trenches with timber, sandbags, and duckboards. Yet continuous bombardments rendered these measures insufficient. Waterlogged parapets collapsed without warning, burying men alive or trapping them in freezing water. The very technologies designed to offer protection, reinforced dugouts, barbed wire, machine gun nests, sometimes accelerated suffering when they failed under environmental stress. Communication technologies were similarly inadequate in the relentless mud. Field telephones relied on lines, often severed by shell fire. Runners risked wading through flooded trenches to deliver messages, sometimes swept into craters or shot by snipers. Wireless radios were bulky and limited in range, while visual signals like flares were constrained by fog, smoke, and darkness. The consequence was an environment in which command decisions were delayed, misinformed, or impossible to execute. Soldiers confronted lethal conditions without guidance, turning minor accidents into fatalities. In many cases, men drowned or became trapped simply because orders for evacuation arrived too late or could not be delivered. Logistical constraints amplified the risks. Supplying frontline troops required navigating mud-filled communication trenches and shell-scarred terrain. Food, water, and medical supplies often arrived late or in insufficient quantities. Field hospitals struggled with overcapacity and exposure to artillery fire. Medical evacuations were complicated by flooded routes and collapsed earthworks. Soldiers suffering from trench foot, gangrene, or exhaustion sometimes waited days for assistance, their condition deteriorating steadily in the saturated trenches. Even basic protective gear, such as rubber boots or waterproof coats, was often unavailable or insufficient, leaving men vulnerable to both environmental hazards and disease. Command dilemmas were intertwined with these technological and logistical challenges. Military leaders, often stationed miles behind the front, issued orders without full knowledge of the trench's conditions. Reports filtered through multiple layers of command, sometimes weeks behind reality. Units were sent into compromised positions, exposed to waterlogged trenches, collapsing walls, and hidden shell craters. The strategy of attrition, central to both British and German war plans, prioritized territorial gains over individual safety, inadvertently transforming environmental hazards into instruments of death. Soldiers were not only fighting the enemy, but navigating a battlefield rendered unpredictable by both human and natural forces. The enemy's role in shaping these lethal conditions was complex. German defensive strategies involved deep, reinforced trenches with multiple layers of protection, making frontal assaults deadly even under ideal conditions. When attacks were launched, soldiers traversed terrain altered by years of bombardment and weather. Flooded trenches slowed movements, forced men to wade through knee or waist-deep water, and delayed reinforcements. Snipers targeted those trapped in these hazards. Counter-battery fire and mortar strikes further destabilized trenches, collapsing walls and filling foxholes with mud. Both sides faced identical environmental threats, demonstrating that trench warfare turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. The human-scale perspective highlights the constant tension between survival and duty. Soldiers adapted strategies for living in saturated trenches, reinforcing parapets, constructing duckboards, creating drainage channels, and sharing limited dry clothing. Comrades assisted one another in moving injured men, keeping feet dry, or improvising shelter from constant rain. Yet these measures were temporary and fragile. Even small errors could prove fatal, as a misstep might send a man into a hidden water-filled crater or under a collapsing wall. Survival depended on constant vigilance, skill, and frequently, luck. The invisible hazards of mud, water, and disease became as lethal as bullets and shells. Psychological strain magnified the physical risks. Men lived with the knowledge that exposure could be fatal. Trench foot, gangrene, and drowning created a constant, silent fear that eroded morale. Letters from soldiers described the dread of waking to flooded trenches or discovering comrades buried by collapsed walls. Sleep deprivation, noise from artillery, and the omnipresence of vermin intensified stress, reducing alertness and increasing the likelihood of accidents. In essence, the trench environment imposed a mental burden as lethal as the battlefield itself. Soldiers confronted death in slow, agonizing ways, shaping both their behavior and their perception of the front. Ethical and moral considerations were often implicit but present. Commanders recognized the dangers of flooded and collapsing trenches, but had limited means to alleviate them without sacrificing operational objectives. Soldiers, too, faced moral dilemmas. Whether to risk personal safety to rescue a comrade from a water-filled foxhole, or whether survival required leaving the injured behind. These micro-decisions occurred constantly, shaping outcomes for individual soldiers and units alike. Death was not only a strategic consequence, but a moral and psychological challenge, imposed by a war environment indifferent to human suffering. Technological innovation and adaptation were ongoing responses to these conditions. Engineers experimented with improved drainage systems, reinforced parapets, and temporary shelters. Rubber-soled boots and water-resistant gear were issued when available. Duckboards became ubiquitous, though frequently submerged or broken under constant use. Nevertheless, these adaptations often lagged behind environmental challenges and operational demands. The pace of change could not match the relentless conditions of trench life, leaving soldiers vulnerable to the slow, invisible killers of mud, water, and collapsing earth. From this perspective, it becomes clear that the most painful deaths of World War I were neither spectacular nor widely recorded. They occurred in the mud-filled trenches, in flooded foxholes, under collapsed parapets, and through disease that advanced silently. Each fatality reflected a complex interplay of human endurance, leadership decisions, technology, terrain, weather, and enemy action. Soldiers confronted multiple simultaneous hazards, requiring not only courage but constant ingenuity and vigilance. The trenches, while protective against direct fire, became instruments of suffering in themselves. These intersecting angles, human experience, tactical reality, technological limits, logistical constraints, command dilemmas, and psychological strain, set the stage for the war's decisive moments. They illuminate the environment in which men faced the slow, agonizing deaths that would define the Western Front. The conditions they endured directly shaped the battles, strategies, and ultimately, the turning points that would follow. July 1st, 1916, the opening day of the Battle of the Somme. At 7:30 a.m., the British artillery bombardment ended, and over 100,000 soldiers rose from their trenches, advancing into no man's land. The air was thick with smoke, the smell of cordite and churned earth, and the bitter tang of anticipation. The terrain before them was a grotesque mixture of shell craters, barbed wire, and mud, transformed over 2 years of relentless warfare. The German defenses, meticulously reinforced and dug deep into the chalk and clay, awaited with machine guns and pre-sighted artillery. Yet it was not only enemy fire that posed a threat. Weeks of rain had turned trenches into waterlogged channels, and men moved through ankle to waist-deep mud, their boots heavy with saturated earth. The ground itself had become an enemy. Troops fell silently to bullets, but more insidious hazards awaited. Soldiers waded into shell craters filled with rainwater, unaware of hidden depths. Men slipped on muddy duckboards or collapsed parapets, their bodies swallowed by the trenches they had called protection. Field hospitals reported cases where soldiers were pulled from waterlogged ditches hours after the bombardment, already succumbing to hypothermia or drowning. Corpses blocked communication trenches, delaying reinforcements and medical aid, and leaving units isolated under enemy fire. The environment amplified the lethality of every tactical decision. Leadership decisions played a decisive role in this first day. General Haig, confident in the efficacy of artillery, had underestimated the resilience of German defenses and overestimated the impact on enemy morale. Reports suggested that enemy wire was destroyed and that German troops had been neutralized. In reality, machine gun nests remained intact, and many German soldiers had survived in deep dugouts, emerging to fire into advancing waves. The slow-moving, waterlogged British divisions were exposed for longer periods, their progress hindered not only by barbed wire, but by the treacherous terrain. Soldiers were pinned in mud-filled craters, unable to rise without risking death. The first day of the Somme exemplifies the interplay of environment, strategy, and human endurance. In many sectors, men who survived artillery and machine gun fire later succumbed to trench hazards. Reports from the Royal Engineers document parapet collapses that buried small groups of soldiers, leaving them trapped beneath saturated earth while nearby comrades watched helplessly. Waterlogged trenches impeded movement, prevented timely evacuation, and increased the mortality rate from injuries and exposure. Death was slow, silent, and compounded by environmental factors that commanders had little capacity to control. The German perspective highlights the duality of trench warfare. Units observed the advancing British troops, aware that artillery had not achieved the intended destruction. They fired from fortified positions while contending with their own waterlogged trenches, recognizing that enemy action and environmental collapse could work together. German soldiers, like their British counterparts, were not immune to flooding, mud, and structural failure. Mortality was high on both sides, and the earth itself exacted a toll equal to that of rifles and shells. The front lines had become an agent of death, impartial and unforgiving. In addition to structural hazards, the first day of the Somme revealed the devastating consequences of logistical failure. Troops advancing across shell-scarred fields were slowed by waterlogged supplies, heavy packs, and equipment soaked through. Communication with rear echelons was difficult. Runners drowned in craters or were shot attempting to navigate the flooded no-man's land. Medical units could not reach wounded soldiers trapped in collapsing trenches or craters, and evacuation routes were blocked by debris and mud. Every environmental obstacle amplified casualty figures, turning tactical errors into human tragedies. Individual stories underscore the human impact. Private soldiers and non-commissioned officers faced choices dictated by survival, not valor. Comrades helped one another through flooded trenches, improvised stretchers, and reinforced collapsing walls. But the scale of the terrain and the intensity of bombardment made rescue limited. Hypothermia, drowning, and gangrene claimed men who survived enemy bullets. Soldiers described the paradox of trenches. Their narrow earthworks offered temporary protection from fire, yet became lethal under artillery or rain. The very structure intended to shield life became an instrument of death. The tactical consequences of July 1st were staggering. British forces suffered nearly 60,000 casualties in a single day, the highest in their military history. Among these were thousands who perished in indirect ways, drowning in shell craters, succumbing to hypothermia, trapped under collapsed parapets. The scale of suffering illuminated the inadequacy of planning for environmental hazards and the human cost of attritional strategy. Commanders were confronted with a realization: artillery alone could not ensure survival, and trench hazards were as lethal as enemy fire. This turning point extended beyond immediate battlefield losses. Units rendered ineffective by waterlogged trenches could not maintain momentum, leaving flanks exposed and creating opportunities for German counterattacks. Troop morale was affected. Soldiers feared not only enemy fire, but the slow, unseen killers of the trenches themselves. Reports from field officers emphasized that many men were incapacitated by environmental conditions before being engaged by combat. A sobering reflection on the lethal interplay of strategy, terrain, and weather. By nightfall, the battlefield was a panorama of devastation. Trenches were filled with water, mud, and debris. Casualties were strewn across no man's land, surviving soldiers huddled in shelters, exhausted and soaked, facing the certainty of another day under the same conditions. The earth had claimed its share of victims, demonstrating that the most painful deaths in World War I were often invisible to history. Men drowned in mud, trapped beneath collapsing earthworks, or felled by disease exacerbated by exposure. The lessons were grim but undeniable. The events of July 1st, 1916, underscore the convergence of strategy, technology, human endurance, and environmental hazard. The Somme did not merely test courage, it exposed the lethal capacity of trenches themselves. Soldiers faced a multi-layered battlefield in which artillery, terrain, weather, and disease combined into a singular, deadly force. Survival depended on skill, resilience, and chance. Yet even the most vigilant men were vulnerable to slow, agonizing death. This first part of the climax establishes the stage for the continuation of the Somme and the broader implications of trench lethality in subsequent operations. The days following July 1st, 1916, continued the grim rhythm of attrition along the Somme. Rain returned with relentless insistence, turning the battlefield into a viscous swamp. Trenches became canals, shell craters filled with water, hiding jagged remnants of barbed wire and splintered timber. Soldiers advanced cautiously, boots heavy with saturated mud, uniforms soaked through, fingers numb from cold. Hypothermia was a constant threat. Entire platoons became immobilized in quagmires, trapped not by enemy fire but by the mud itself. Corpses sank partially into water-filled trenches, hidden beneath boards or sandbags, their presence compounding both the physical and psychological hazards for the living. Artillery barrages continued, not only destroying enemy positions, but collapsing trench walls and dugouts. German and British soldiers alike experienced the horror of being buried alive. Reports from field hospitals and engineers describe men pulled from parapets, collapsed under shell fire. Some still alive, but trapped in suffocating earth. Others already dead from trauma. Attempts to dig out survivors were often delayed by renewed bombardment or flooded trenches, leaving men to suffocate or drown. These deaths were agonizingly slow, invisible to the outside world, and largely absent from official casualty counts. The battlefield itself had become an executioner. Small units tried to navigate the treacherous terrain using duckboards and makeshift bridges over flooded sections. Engineers reinforced trenches with timber. Yet the scale of destruction made comprehensive repair impossible. Communication with rear commands was intermittent, and many battalions became isolated, forced to endure environmental hazards while awaiting orders. Supply lines faltered as wagons and pack animals became stuck in mud or drowned in shell craters. Water and food shortages intensified the physical toll, weakening men already exhausted by exposure and continuous engagement. Soldiers described the paradox of trench warfare. The trenches provided shelter, yet demanded endurance beyond human limits, exacting a slow, invisible toll that outpaced enemy fire. Command decisions remained critical in determining survival. Some units attempted night advances to reduce exposure, only to find waterlogged trenches and shell-scarred terrain slowed movement and increased risk of drowning or being trapped beneath collapsing walls. Officers faced moral dilemmas. Pressing an attack might achieve strategic objectives, but could send men into sections of trenches known to be unstable or flooded. The operational imperative of attrition collided with environmental reality, producing outcomes in which strategic success was measured against massive human suffering. By mid-July, the cumulative impact of environmental hazards and combat losses was staggering. Reports indicated that trench foot afflicted thousands of soldiers, leading to gangrene and amputation in severe cases. Rain continued to fill trenches and craters, creating rivers of mud that trapped men and delayed evacuations. Shellfire destabilized parapets and dugouts, causing deaths from collapses that were impossible to predict or prevent. In certain sectors, more men died from exposure, drowning, or structural collapse than from direct enemy fire. The Somme was no longer merely a battlefield. It was a complex death trap shaped by human engineering, natural forces, and the relentless machinery of war. Human experience during this period underscores the brutality of slow environmental death. Soldiers recounted waking to find comrades submerged in muddy water, unable to extract them before hypothermia set in. Rats gnawed on exposed bodies, spreading disease and amplifying psychological strain. Field hospitals documented infections stemming from minor wounds, left untreated due to delays in evacuation. Letters from the front reveal that dread of water-filled trenches and collapsing walls rivaled fear of enemy bullets. Survival required ingenuity and constant vigilance, yet many men succumbed despite extraordinary effort. The environment itself dictated outcomes. German forces, entrenched and reinforced, faced similar threats. Flooded trenches slowed movement, delayed supply, and created secondary hazards for their own troops. Machine gun nests sometimes became inaccessible, forcing soldiers to navigate mud and water under fire. Shelling from British batteries collapsed defensive positions, producing casualties indistinguishable from direct combat deaths. Commanders had to weigh the risk of environmental hazards against tactical objectives, often accepting high attrition as inevitable. Both sides confronted the realization that the trenches themselves had become instruments of mortality, indifferent to nationality or allegiance. Artillery barrages compounded the lethality of waterlogged trenches. Explosive force destabilized saturated earth, sending soldiers into quagmires or burying them under tons of mud. Engineers documented repeated failures of parapets and dugouts under shell fire, emphasizing that structural collapse was a predictable hazard in the wet, churned-up terrain. Soldiers trapped beneath collapsed walls faced suffocation, drowning, or crush injuries. Attempts at extraction were perilous and often delayed by renewed bombardment, turning rescue into a high-risk operation. The battlefield's topography, altered by shell fire and weather, dictated survival as much as combat skill or courage. By late July, the scale of environmental fatalities was evident. Thousands of soldiers suffered from trench foot, hypothermia, drowning, or being buried alive. Evacuation delays, waterlogged supply lines, and continued shelling ensured that mortality remained high. Mortality statistics from field reports indicate that in certain sectors, environmental hazards claimed more lives than bullets or shrapnel. These deaths were slow, silent, and largely unrecorded in popular histories. Yet they shaped both the conduct of operations and the psychological state of soldiers on the front. The turning point of this period is not a single moment, but the cumulative recognition of the trench's lethal capacity. Commanders gradually realized that traditional strategies of attrition had to account for environmental hazards. Yet, adaptations lagged behind reality. Soldiers adapted through ingenuity, reinforcing walls, creating drainage channels, and establishing elevated walkways. Still, the scale of destruction, persistent rainfall, and relentless artillery made complete mitigation impossible. Death remained omnipresent, slow, and indiscriminate. By the end of July, the Somme stood as a testament to the dual lethality of modern warfare. Men were destroyed by bullets, shells, and machine guns, but equally by mud, water, collapsing earthworks, and infection. Trench life demanded resilience, ingenuity, and endurance. Yet even the most prepared soldiers were vulnerable. Survival depended on constant vigilance, improvisation, and above all, luck. In these conditions, the most painful deaths of the Western Front were neither immediate nor visible. They were drawn out, agonizing, and mediated by the environment itself. This extended climax sets the stage for the aftermath/consequences, documenting the immediate and long-term human, tactical, and strategic effects of these lethal trench conditions on soldiers, commanders, and operations across the Western Front. By August 1916, the Somme had etched itself into memory as a theater of unimaginable suffering. Casualty figures were staggering. The British alone had suffered over 420,000 losses, with German estimates reaching 450,000. Yet these numbers obscure a subtler, more insidious truth. Thousands of deaths were indirect, the result of conditions inherent to the trenches themselves. Soldiers drowned in flooded foxholes, succumbed to hypothermia, or developed gangrene from trench foot. Corpses blocked communication trenches, delaying aid and amplifying mortality. The battlefield had become an ecosystem of death, in which environmental factors operated alongside bullets and shells. Survival was contingent not solely on courage or skill, but on endurance in the face of mud, water, disease, and structural instability. The human impact was profound. Soldiers who endured the first weeks of the Somme reported chronic exhaustion, nightmares, and heightened anxiety, fearing not only enemy fire, but the slow hazards of the trenches. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, often lacking sufficient medical personnel, equipment, or dry space to treat the sick and injured. Gangrene, frostbite, pneumonia, and dysentery claimed lives long after men left the front lines. Evacuation procedures, delayed by flooded trenches and debris, exacerbated the death toll. Letters and diaries recount soldiers watching comrades trapped in water-filled shell craters, unable to rescue them without risking their own lives. These slow, silent deaths created a pervasive atmosphere of dread and despair. Operationally, the lethality of the trenches forced military leaders to reconsider strategy. Attritional attacks, which had relied on overwhelming artillery barrages followed by infantry advances, exposed troops to both enemy fire and environmental hazards. Commanders recognized that even successful assaults could result in heavy, indirect casualties due to trench flooding, structural collapse, or disease. Reports from engineers and medical officers highlighted sections of trenches that were effectively uninhabitable, requiring diversion of troops and resources simply to maintain defensive integrity. Leadership faced a grim reality. The battlefield itself was an unpredictable, deadly force. Logistical consequences were equally severe. The disruption of supply lines by mud and shelling meant that rations, water, ammunition, and medical supplies were frequently delayed or lost. Field kitchens, dugouts, and supply depots were often submerged, forcing soldiers to subsist on minimal rations while wading through waterlogged trenches. Transportation of the wounded was slowed by collapsed earthworks and quagmires, increasing mortality rates. Horses and mules, essential for hauling supplies, frequently became trapped in mud or drowned, further impeding operational efficiency. Commanders had to allocate manpower and engineering resources to maintain the trenches themselves, diverting effort from offensive operations. The psychological impact extended beyond the frontline soldiers. Commanders reported declining morale, increased nervous disorders, and hesitation during operations due to fear of environmental hazards. Units were less cohesive when men faced simultaneous threats of bullets, shells, and collapsing trenches. Letters from soldiers emphasize a pervasive dread of flooding, mud, and trench foot, alongside a sense of helplessness against forces beyond immediate control. Even those who survived unscathed carried the memory of these slow, agonizing deaths, which influenced their behavior in subsequent operations. Casualty distribution underscores the scale of environmental mortality. While direct combat accounted for tens of thousands of fatalities, reports suggest that in certain sectors, indirect deaths caused by trench hazards equaled or exceeded those from enemy fire. Units trapped in flooded trenches experienced losses from drowning, exposure, and infection. Engineers noted parapet collapses burying small groups of men, often with no opportunity for rescue due to ongoing bombardment. Medical records confirm that gangrene and trench foot resulted in thousands of amputations and deaths, often in soldiers who had survived the initial assault. These statistics reveal a pattern. Environmental hazards were systematic killers, as lethal as any weapon. Civilian populations near the front also bore consequences. Flooded fields, destroyed drainage systems, and displaced communities complicated logistics for both armies. Villages and farms could not provide reliable water, food, or shelter. Soldiers were forced to adapt to environmental conditions without adequate support, magnifying both suffering and operational difficulty. The interdependence of terrain, weather, and human activity became a critical factor in the conduct of war. Commanders could not isolate military operations from the environmental realities shaped by years of bombardment, seasonal rainfall, and human displacement. The prolonged exposure to lethal conditions shaped military doctrine. Subsequent operations increasingly considered trench reinforcement, drainage, and troop rotation as critical to minimizing indirect casualties. Duckboards, timber reinforcements, and drainage channels became standard, though insufficient to fully mitigate environmental hazards. Recognition of indirect deaths influenced planning for offensives, with engineers and medical officers integrated more closely into operational decisions. Lessons learned from the Somme regarding waterlogged trenches, collapsed parapets, and disease prevention would inform both immediate strategy and broader military engineering practices. Beyond immediate survival, these experiences shaped the culture of the armies involved. Soldiers developed ingenuity in coping with water, mud, and disease, creating improvised drainage, makeshift shelters, and temporary reinforcement of parapets. Collective effort to survive environmental hazards became a component of unit cohesion. Yet the constant threat of slow death left lasting psychological scars, contributing to what would later be recognized as combat stress disorders. The battlefield's lethality extended beyond the tactical and operational level, leaving enduring human consequences. By the end of the Somme's initial phases, the war had demonstrated that the environment could be as deadly as the enemy. Mud, water, collapsing earthworks, and disease created conditions in which men perished slowly, silently, and invisibly. Strategic gains were weighed against a background of pervasive suffering, and commanders faced a stark choice between operational necessity and the human cost of attrition. These lessons were hard-earned, written in the mud and water of the trenches, and etched into the lives of soldiers who survived the ordeal. The first section of Aftermath establishes both the human and operational consequences of trench hazards, revealing the invisible toll of environmental mortality. These conditions set the stage for the second section, which will examine long-term effects, strategic shifts, and the enduring psychological and operational impact on soldiers and commanders alike. As the Somme campaign progressed into late 1916, the cumulative impact of environmental hazards became painfully evident. Soldiers who survived the initial assaults continued to face relentless exposure. Flooded trenches trapped men for days, while shelling undermined parapets, leaving dugouts unstable and dangerous. Reports from field hospitals document soldiers suffering from gangrene, trench foot, and hypothermia weeks after frontline service. Even minor injuries became life-threatening when medical care was delayed by impassable, waterlogged communication trenches. The war had created a persistent, slow-acting killer that operated independently of direct combat. Strategically, these environmental realities forced both sides to adapt. The British and Germans recognized that attritional offensives could be nullified by the lethal conditions of the trenches themselves. Engineers were tasked with improving drainage, reinforcing parapets, and constructing elevated walkways to mitigate flooding. Commanders integrated these measures into operational planning, though the scale of destruction and persistent rainfall meant that no adaptation was fully sufficient. Waterlogged trenches dictated troop movements, slowed assaults, and increased casualties in ways that could not be fully predicted. The Somme became a laboratory for understanding how environmental hazards could dictate battlefield outcomes. The psychological consequences were severe and enduring. Soldiers described an ever-present fear of the trench itself. Diaries recount men dreading the approach of night, when water levels could rise, or anticipating that a fresh bombardment would collapse a partially reinforced parapet. Even those who avoided injury or illness experienced trauma, witnessing comrades drown, become trapped, or slowly succumb to gangrene. Letters and memoirs reveal that these experiences shaped post-war perceptions of warfare, leaving many with chronic anxiety, sleep disorders, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The psychological toll extended beyond the front, influencing soldiers' reintegration into civilian life and shaping broader societal understanding of the war's cost. Casualty figures, when broken down, underscore the silent lethality of environmental hazards. In some sectors, the proportion of deaths caused by drowning, trench foot, exposure, or being buried under collapsed earthworks rivaled or exceeded fatalities from enemy fire. Engineers' reports indicate repeated parapet failures and collapsed dugouts, often resulting in multiple fatalities at once. Waterlogged trenches delayed evacuation and amplified the lethality of minor wounds. Soldiers became prisoners not only of enemy action, but of geography and weather. These patterns forced military planners to reconsider the allocation of resources toward trench stabilization, drainage, and medical readiness. The operational impact was profound. Units immobilized by flooding or trapped in unstable trenches were less capable of coordinated attacks, leaving flanks exposed and delaying planned offensives. Reinforcements struggled to reach frontline positions, and supply convoys became unreliable. The ability to sustain prolonged operations depended increasingly on engineering, logistics, and adaptation, rather than mere numbers or firepower. Commanders recognized that battlefield dominance required controlling environmental variables as much as defeating the enemy. Yet in practice, these variables were often uncontrollable, leading to repeated tragedies and cumulative attrition. Medical lessons emerged from these experiences. The Royal Army Medical Corps and German medical units documented the devastating effects of trench foot, gangrene, and hypothermia, emphasizing prevention through regular foot inspections, improved drainage, and rotations out of saturated trenches. Rubber-soled boots, trench boards, and more robust protective gear were introduced, though distribution was uneven. Evacuation protocols were refined, with stretcher teams and temporary shelters established to address delays caused by flooding and mud. Still, these measures arrived too late for thousands who had already succumbed. The war revealed that battlefield medicine had to contend not only with bullets and shrapnel, but with the environment itself. The cumulative mortality and suffering had lasting effects on military doctrine. Both sides learned that environmental hazards could not be ignored in planning operations. Engineers and medical officers became integral to operational strategy, responsible for mitigating conditions that could claim lives without enemy intervention. Troop rotation schedules were adjusted to reduce prolonged exposure, and trench construction techniques were modified to minimize flooding. Yet, despite these lessons, attritional strategy continued to dominate, ensuring that environmental hazards would remain a deadly companion to combat. The long-term human consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. Soldiers who survived the Somme carried physical injuries, chronic illness, and psychological scars. Gangrene amputations left permanent disabilities. Hypothermia and repeated exposure weakened bodies, increasing vulnerability to illness. Psychological trauma, arising from witnessing slow, agonizing deaths, created a pervasive fear of environmental hazards that persisted long after active combat. Letters and post-war memoirs reflect a profound awareness among veterans that survival depended as much on navigating mud, water, and collapsing earth as on facing enemy fire. Finally, the Somme's environmental toll reshaped public perception and military historiography. While popular narratives often focus on artillery, machine guns, and heroism, accounts of drowning, trench foot, and deaths under collapsed parapets highlight the invisible suffering of ordinary soldiers. These deaths were painful, prolonged, and largely unrecorded in official statistics. Yet they defined the lived experience of the trenches. They reveal the brutal reality of World War I, that men were often destroyed not by bullets alone, but by the earth, water, and mud that defined the Western Front. The trenches of World War I were more than lines of defense. They were environments that shaped life, death, and memory. Men entered these earthworks seeking protection from enemy fire, yet found themselves at the mercy of mud, rain, and unstable ground. Drowning in shell craters, succumbing to trench foot, or being buried beneath collapsing parapets were not exceptional tragedies. They were systemic, a quiet testament to the unforgiving reality of modern industrial warfare. The slow, agonizing deaths that unfolded in these conditions were as telling of the conflict as the roar of artillery or the crack of rifles. They reveal a war in which human endurance was tested against not only human foes, but the battlefield itself. These experiences illuminate the interplay between technology, strategy, and human vulnerability. Artillery reshaped the earth. Floods transformed trenches into death traps. Disease and exposure compounded combat losses. Soldiers faced a multidimensional threat, one that required courage, ingenuity, and constant vigilance. The lessons drawn from these conditions informed military engineering, medical practices, and operational planning. Duckboards, drainage, and rotations were responses to environments that had proven lethally indifferent to planning or discipline. Yet, despite these innovations, the human cost remained high, a reminder that even calculated strategy cannot fully tame nature's unpredictability in war. The suffering endured in these trenches also left enduring psychological and cultural marks. Veterans carried the memory of slow, invisible deaths. The fear of water-filled trenches, collapsing parapets, and unseen hazards persisted long after the guns fell silent. These experiences shaped post-war perceptions of conflict, emphasizing that heroism alone could not guarantee survival. History records valor, but it is the silent, agonizing deaths that offer the most profound insight into the human experience of World War I. Ultimately, the most painful trench deaths underscore a simple yet sobering truth. War is not only fought between armies, but against the very environment that hosts it. The earth, water, and mud of the Western Front were as decisive as any weapon, as merciless as any adversary. Recognizing these realities honors the men who endured unimaginable conditions, revealing a war defined not only by battles and strategy, but by endurance, suffering, and the resilience of the human spirit. In remembering them, we confront the full measure of sacrifice demanded by modern war, and the quiet, invisible horrors that history sometimes overlooks.